The morning mist clung to the Utah mountains like a widow's veil, thin and gray against the awakening sky. Spring had come reluctantly to the valley in 1884, leaving small patches of stubborn snow where the sun couldn't quite reach. The air carried that sharp, lonely freshness only mountain mornings hold, clean, cold, and quiet. Thatcher Cain stood on his porch, steam curling from the tin mug in his calloused hands, watching sunlight paint the peaks in soft gold. At 40, he wore his solitude like a second skin. His face was weathered from years of wind and sun, and deep lines framed a mouth unused to laughter. Every fence post and outbuilding on his ranch bore the mark of his own hands. 200 acres of rough land, small compared to the big outfits down in Salt Lake Valley, but it was his. 15 years he'd worked it alone. 15 years since the fever took Margaret and left him with nothing but ghosts and silence. He didn't think about women anymore, or told himself he didn't. The folks in Millwater, 20 miles east, had long since stopped trying to find him company. "That Cain fellow," they'd say, shaking their heads, "might as well be a monk up there in those mountains." The cattle were already stirring in the lower pasture, their breath rising in small clouds. Thatcher drained the last of his coffee and went about his morning chores, his movements steady and practiced. Feed the horses, check the water troughs, inspect the fence line where wolves had been testing it lately. His life was routine, safe in its emptiness. Near noon, he spotted dust rising on the wagon road, an odd sight in a place where visitors rarely came. He shaded his eyes. Not a wagon. A single figure on foot, walking slow and uncertain, like someone nearly spent. Curiosity overcame his usual wish for solitude. He set down the harness he'd been mending and walked toward the road. The figure resolved into a woman. Her brown wool traveling dress was gray with dust, her bonnet askew, her carpetbag dragging at her arm. When she lifted her head, he saw hair the color of autumn leaves, not quite red, not quite brown, catching light like burnished copper. She swayed, then stopped. "Mr. Thatcher Cain?" Her voice was hoarse with exhaustion, but steady underneath. He nodded, surprised to hear his own name spoken in a woman's voice after so many years. "Thank the Lord," she breathed, and then her knees gave out. Thatcher caught her before she hit the ground. She felt light as a child in his arms. Pale, younger than he'd thought, maybe 25 or 30. He half carried her to the porch, settling her into the old rocking chair Margaret once loved. His hands trembled as he pumped water from the well. He cursed himself for the shaking. She was a traveler, nothing more. When she'd drunk her fill, color returned to her cheeks. "I've come such a long way," she said, a faint smile flickering through fatigue. 3 days on the train, then the stage to Millwater, and walking since dawn when the driver refused to go further into the mountains. She reached into her bag with trembling fingers and pulled out an envelope. "But I'm here now. I'm Eloise Mercer, Mr. Cain, your bride." The words hit him like a hammer. He stared at her. "My what?" Quote, "Your bride," she repeated gently, though her voice wavered. "From the agency in Chicago. The letter you sent said you needed a wife, someone strong enough for mountain living." He took the letter with numb hands. His name was there at the bottom, plain as truth, but the handwriting wasn't his. The words above it were a stranger's. Directions to his ranch, a plea for companionship, even mention of the wolves that plagued his herd. "This isn't my hand," he said quietly. "I never wrote this." Color drained from her face. "That can't be," she whispered. "I left everything. I traveled 2,000 miles. I have nowhere else to go." The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the soft lowing of cattle and the whisper of pine wind. Thatcher could see the moment she understood. Her spine straightened. Her chin lifted, but her hands trembled. "I see," she said with quiet dignity. "Then I apologize for the intrusion. If you could direct me back to town." "It's 20 miles," he said. "And there's weather coming." "Then I'd best start walking." "You won't make it." The words came out harsher than he meant. "Not in your condition." She turned to him, eyes fierce despite exhaustion. "Then what would you have me do, Mr. Cain? Camp on your doorstep like a beggar?" He dragged a hand through his hair, frustrated and unsettled. The sensible thing was to take her to town, let someone else deal with her. He'd built this quiet life carefully, and he didn't need a stranger, especially a woman, to shake it apart. But looking at her standing there, chin high despite trembling legs, clutching that carpet bag like it held her whole world, he heard himself say the words he'd regret and treasure both. "You can stay the night, just tonight. I'll take you to town in the morning." Relief flickered across her face before she hid it behind politeness. "That's very kind, Mr. Cain. I'll work for my keep. I'm not afraid of hard work." He almost smiled. "There's a room off the kitchen. It's clean. You can rest there." Quote. As he led her inside, he tried not to notice how the light caught her copper hair, or how her presence filled the empty spaces of the house. The rooms felt smaller, alive in a way they hadn't in 15 years. It unsettled him deeply. "The handwriting," she said softly as he set her bag down. "Who do you think wrote it, if not you?" He shrugged. Could be anyone's idea of a joke. "Someone thought you needed something," she murmured, then stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "I don't need anything," he said too roughly. "I'll bring water for washing. Supper's at 6. He fled to the barn, the only place that still felt safe. But even there, surrounded by hay and horses, he couldn't stop thinking of her, of the way she'd looked when she fainted, of her quiet strength when she'd realized the truth. By nightfall, rain began to drum on the roof. When he finally entered the house, he found the table set, the stove warm, and the air filled with the smell of stew and fresh bread. She stood by the fire, in a simple blue dress, hair pinned up, her face soft in the glow. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "I found supplies in your pantry." It seemed the least I could do. He stood in his own doorway like a stranger, watching her move about the kitchen with a calm grace. They ate in silence, thunder rolling outside, the warmth of the fire closing in around them. When she finally said goodnight and closed the door to her small room, Thatcher sat staring at the dying fire, aware of the unfamiliar ache in his chest. For 15 years he had lived among ghosts. Tonight, for the first time, he felt the living presence of another soul inside his walls, and it frightened him more than any storm. The storm hadn't passed by morning. It hung over the valley like a dark blanket, pouring steady rain that turned the wagon road into a river of mud. Thatcher stood by the window, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the gray sheets of rain swallow the mountains. Behind him, he could hear Eloise moving quietly in the kitchen. The soft sound of dishes, the steady rhythm of her work, filled the silence in a way that felt unsettlingly natural. "I can try walking if you need me gone," she said from the doorway. He didn't turn around. "You'd be dead before you reached the first mile marker. Roads are washed out by now." "Then I'll work for my keep," she said firmly. "I won't be a burden." He looked over his shoulder then. Her hair was pinned tightly, her plain dress neat despite wear. Her hands were red from washing, yet she held her chin high. She wasn't fragile, this woman. She had survived too much to be fragile. "Suit yourself," he said curtly, though part of him admired her stubbornness. The letter lay on the kitchen table where he'd left it. He found himself studying it again as she moved about the room. Whoever wrote it had known things they shouldn't. The ranch's layout, the wolves, even a mention of Margaret, though not by name. The details were too specific to be a random prank. Eloise came to stand beside him. "May I see it again?" He handed it over. She studied it carefully, running one finger across the paper. "This stationery," she said slowly. "It's from the Millwater General Store. See the watermark?" Quote. He leaned in. She was right. There was a faint stamp in the corner. "Someone local wrote this," she said. "Someone who knows you well enough to forge your name." "Someone who thought I needed a wife badly enough to trick one into coming," he muttered. She looked up at him. "That's a lot of trouble to go through for a joke. Maybe it wasn't a prank." He snorted. "Nobody cares that much." "Jake Monroe," she said quietly. He froze. Jake had been his friend since they were boys, the only one who still visited from time to time. The same man who'd been acting strange on his last trip, asking odd questions about loneliness in the future. "I'll deal with Jake when the weather clears," Thatcher said darkly. "And what will you do to him?" "I haven't decided yet." She surprised him by laughing softly. Maybe remember that his intentions, however misguided, might have come from kindness. "Kindness?" he scoffed. "He lied to you, dragged you across the country." "He gave me a chance to leave a place where I had no future," she said. "Even if it was built on a lie, it was still a chance." He wanted to ask what she meant, what kind of life she'd left behind, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed for the barn, escaping into the rain. Hours later, when he came back drenched, the house smelled of coffee and baking bread. Eloise was humming softly as she kneaded dough. The tune was faint but steady, and the sound tugged at something deep in him he thought had died long ago. They ate together again that night, the storm hammering the roof. Lightning flashed, and Eloise flinched. "Afraid of thunder?" he asked. "Not afraid," she said quietly. "Just respectful of it. My father used to tell me thunder was God moving furniture in heaven." He almost smiled. "Your father's still alive?" "No," she said softly, "nor my mother. The consumption took them both 3 winters ago." "I'm sorry." She shrugged, but he saw the tightness in her jaw. "It's why I answered the advertisement. I had nothing left. No family, no prospects, just a job at a boarding house that barely kept me fed. Your letter, the one I thought was yours, felt like providence. And instead, you got fraud. And instead," she said gently, "I got shelter from a storm. Sometimes that's enough." The fire crackled between them. They finished eating in silence, though it wasn't the cold silence of strangers anymore. It was softer, almost companionable. "Tell me about her," Eloise said suddenly. He stiffened. "About who?" "Margaret," she said simply, "because her absence fills this house like smoke." Her words should have angered him, but they didn't. Instead, he felt something give way inside him. He sat down, staring into the fire. "She laughed at everything," he said finally. "Found joy in small things. A new calf. The way ice formed on the window in winter. She made this place a home." "How long were you married?" 3 years, he said, voice low. "Then the fever came. I was in town when she took sick. By the time I got back," he stopped, throat tight, "she died calling my name." The silence that followed was heavy with old grief. Then Eloise did something unexpected. She dragged the other chair closer to his, close enough that he could feel her warmth. She didn't speak. She just sat there quietly, sharing the silence. "I used to work in a boarding house," she said finally. "Long hours. Men who thought a serving girl was fair game. The owner, Mr. Garrett, was the worst. He'd corner me whenever he could." She paused, took a shaky breath. "When I saw that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I thought anything had to be better. A husband, even a stranger, seemed safer." Thatcher's fists clenched. "Did he hurt you?" "Not in ways that show," she said. "But yes, he hurt me. That's why I ran. Why I spent every penny I had to come here. Even if you'd been cruel, I'd still have had more safety here than there." "You're safe now," Thatcher said fiercely. "For as long as you're under my roof." She turned to him, eyes shimmering in the firelight. "Am I? A woman alone with a man in the mountains?" "You're safe from me," he said. "I believe you," she whispered. That trust, so freely given, shook him more than any accusation could have. They sat there until the fire burned low, until the storm softened to a steady drizzle. When she finally rose, she paused by her door. "What happens when the rain stops?" He looked at her, unable to lie. "I don't know. Do you want me to go?" Quote. He hesitated too long. "I don't know either," she said softly. Then she closed the door. Thatcher sat staring at the dying embers, the question hanging in the air long after she'd gone. He had spent 15 years trying not to feel anything. But that night, listening to her quiet breathing through the thin wall, he knew something inside him had already begun to change. The rain finally stopped 2 days later, leaving the valley washed clean and glittering in the spring sun. Birds sang from the trees, and the mountain air smelled fresh again. Thatcher stood on the porch with his coffee, staring at the distant road that led toward Millwater. The mud was drying fast. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd take Eloise back to town. But when he turned and saw her hanging laundry in the yard, hair catching the light like fire, something in his chest tightened. He'd spent years believing peace meant solitude. Now peace looked like a woman's hands pinning a white sheet to a line. A week passed, then another. The road dried, but neither of them mentioned leaving. Eloise worked like she'd always belonged there, feeding chickens, mending clothes, humming softly as she moved through the house. Thatcher told himself each morning he'd drive her to town, and each night he found another reason to wait one more day. Late one evening he found her by the fire, reading from a worn Bible that had once belonged to Margaret. She didn't close it when he entered. Instead, she traced the pressed wildflowers between its pages with gentle fingers. "Those were hers," he said quietly. "I know," Eloise replied. She must have loved flowers. She did. She said she wanted to keep summer through the winter. "She sounds like someone worth loving," Eloise said. She was. He paused. "But so are you." Her eyes lifted to his. Something unspoken passed between them. Then she smiled faintly and returned to her book. But the air between them had changed. The next morning, Thatcher woke, coughing and feverish. Eloise found him in the barn, slumped against a post, his skin burning. Without hesitation, she got him inside, forced bitter tea between his lips, cooled his forehead with damp cloths. When he tried to protest, she silenced him with a look. "You'd do the same for me," she said. And he knew she was right. For 3 days she nursed him, barely sleeping, her small hand always near his. When he woke at last, weak but clear-headed, she was asleep in a chair beside him, her hand resting on the quilt close to his arm. For a long moment, he just watched her, her face soft in sleep, strands of copper hair loose around her cheeks. When she stirred, he whispered, "Eloise." Her eyes opened slowly. Seeing him awake, she smiled with pure relief. "Your fever's gone. Thanks to you. You'd have done the same." He shook his head faintly. "I'm not sure I would have known how." Quote. She reached out, brushed his cheek lightly. "You would have. You just needed someone to remind you." After that, things were different. They didn't speak of it, but every look lingered longer. Every shared task felt easier. Thatcher began to wonder if maybe Jake's lie had been more like Providence after all. But then, 3 days later, Eloise collapsed by the chicken coop. Her face burned with fever. Thatcher's heart stopped. He carried her inside, laid her on the same bed where she'd nursed him. "Don't fuss," she whispered faintly. "Just a cold." It wasn't. By nightfall, she was delirious, calling out in her sleep, begging someone named Garrett to stop. Thatcher's chest ached with rage and helplessness. He sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering, "You're safe. He can't hurt you here." Her eyes opened halfway, unfocused, but her fingers tightened on his. "Promise me," she breathed. "I promise," he said fiercely. "No one will ever hurt you again." She sighed, drifted back into sleep. Thatcher stayed there through the night, cooling her skin, murmuring words he hadn't said aloud in years. When dawn came, her fever broke. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the window and touched her face. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. "You stayed," she whispered. "Of course I stayed." She smiled faintly. "Then we're even." He shook his head. "Not even close." Over the next days, she grew stronger. But Thatcher knew something had shifted inside him. The walls he'd built to keep the world out had finally crumbled. When she could stand again, they walked together along the fence line. Spring had come in full force. Green meadows, wildflowers, a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "I can see why you stayed." He nodded. Margaret loved spring, said it made the winters worth it. "Do you think she'd mind me being here?" Eloise asked. He looked at her for a long moment. No. I think she'd be furious at me for taking 15 years to let someone else in. Eloise smiled. Then I'll take that as approval. Quote, that night, they sat by the fire, closer than ever. The quiet between them felt warm, full of promise. Eloise, he said suddenly, about that letter. I think Jake wrote it. I think you're right. When I see him, He stopped. I don't know what I'll do. She laid her hand on his. Thank him, she said softly, for seeing what you needed before you did. He stared at her hand in his. Small, strong, sure. Then he looked up. Eloise, I don't want you to leave. I was hoping you'd say that, she whispered. When he kissed her, it was slow and tender, the kind of kiss that mended something broken in both of them. Later, with her head resting on his shoulder, rain began again outside, soft and steady. Do you think this is what Providence looks like? She asked. He smiled faintly. Maybe Providence just needed a little help from a meddling friend. Months later, spring melted into summer. The ranch was alive again with laughter, fresh curtains in the windows, and the smell of bread baking. Thatcher and Eloise married quietly in Millwater. Jake and his wife stood as witnesses, grinning through tears. By autumn, Eloise's belly was round with new life. Thatcher often caught himself watching her in the garden, sunlight in her copper hair, wonder in his chest that he could ever have been so lucky. He'd once believed love died with Margaret, but love, he'd learned, was like the mountain spring. It never truly dried up. It only waited for the right season to flow again. And sometimes, that season came by mistake.